Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know, we always like to get our hands dirty with a big stack of books and articles, but this time we're doing something a little different. We're going to really dive deep into just one book that we think is just packed with really, really interesting insights about thinking.
A deep dive on deep thinking. I like
Yeah,
it.
exactly. And it's a book called Think More, Think Better by this fascinating guy, Donnie Sanchez Crespo. And you know what I love about him is he's kind of this ultimate multi-hyphenate. He's like a video game designer slash entrepreneur slash university professor. So he's coming at this whole thinking thing from a lot of different angles.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm really curious to hear how those different roles and experiences might have shaped his perspective.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And the core idea in this book, it's so simple, but it's also kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it. He says thinking it's not this innate talent that you're either born with or you're not. It's a skill.
Yeah.
Like it's something you can actually learn
Mm.
and improve, just like playing the piano or learning to paint.
I'm already feeling better about myself.
Right? No more like beating yourself up for not being like the smartest person in the room. You can actually work at this.
Mm.
And Sanchez Crespo, he actually does a great job of making this really relatable. He shares all these stories from his own life where he's used these thinking skills to overcome challenges
Yeah.
or, achieve his goals. Like there's this one story when he was a kid, he had asthma, right? And he actually came up with this whole plan to try to get out of military service.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So even as a kid, he was already thinking strategically, like analyzing systems, looking for leverage points. It's pretty cool.
That's a great example of how this stuff is actually practical. It's not just some abstract theory. It's about navigating the real world.
Totally. And there's another story he tells about becoming this successful entrepreneur, even though he talks about feeling kind of useless in more traditional job settings.
You know, that resonates with me. A lot of people feel that way, don't they? They don't quite fit in the conventional box. And I think what strikes me there is that he was able to recognize his own strengths, to find that niche, that superpower he had, and figure out how to leverage it.
Exactly. It's about knowing your strengths for sure, but also realizing that thinking itself is this skill you can hone, this muscle you can train to become even more effective in whatever you're passionate about.
And this is where it gets really, really fascinating because what Sanchez Crespo argues is that this transition from just believing things to having repeatable, objective, knowledge-like techniques for thinking, this is how societies progress. Think about the difference between early humans being terrified of lightning versus modern meteorology.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great example. We've gone from superstition to scientific understanding. And that process of figuring things out, testing them, refining our understanding, that's driven by improving our thinking skills, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's not just about understanding the world around us. It's also about taking that understanding and applying it, using it to solve problems, make decisions, achieve goals. That's what this book is really all about.
I can already hear our listeners saying, okay, that's great, but how do I actually master these techniques? How do I use them to actually make my own life better?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Whether you're trying to get ahead in your career or build stronger relationships or just navigate this crazy world, these are the skills that make all the difference.
All right, so we've established thinking is a skill, not like some kind of mysterious gift, right? But now the big question, how do we actually get better at it? What are the tools, the techniques? Thankfully, Sanchez Crespo doesn't leave us hanging. He's got a whole bunch of practical advice.
He does, and he breaks it down into these two really useful categories. Generating ideas, which is obviously super important for anyone who wants to be more creative and innovative, and then problem solving, which, let's face it, we all need a little help with sometimes.
Okay, so let's start with idea generation. This is where Sanchez Crespo gets really interesting because he's a big believer in something he calls hyperstimulation.
Hyperstimulation, it sounds kind of intense.
He does, right? But it's actually really cool. So basically, it's all about deliberately exposing yourself to new environments, new experiences, new anything really, as a way to shake up your thinking and spark fresh ideas.
So, if you're stuck in a rut, the best thing you can do is get out of your comfort zone.
Exactly. He talks about visiting a crowded food market in Hong Kong and just being bombarded with all these unfamiliar sights, sounds, smells, even languages he didn't understand. And he said it was like this incredible idea gold mine, just from that sensory overload.
That makes a lot of sense when you think about how our brains are wired, right? We crave novelty. New and interesting experiences actually trigger the release of dopamine, which is that feel-good chemical that makes us want to explore and learn.
So basically, our brains reward us for breaking out of our routines.
Precisely. And when you're stuck in that same old routine, your thinking can get kind of stuck on autopilot too. So by shaking things up, you're forcing your brain to wake up, to pay attention, to make new connections. And to give you a really practical tool for this, Sanchez Crespo introduces this thing called the scamper method.
Okay, scamper. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this.
So it's a really clever technique for systematically analyzing and modifying existing products or services to generate new ideas. And we won't go through all the details right now, but trust me, it's worth checking out. You basically go through these 7 different lenses, like substitute, combine, adapt, things like that, to see if you can come up with some really innovative variations.
Sounds like a great way to kickstart the creative process
Mhm.
if you're feeling stuck.
It really is. And speaking of getting unstuck, let's move on to problem solving, because Sanchez Crespo has some really insightful things to say about that as well. And one of his biggest points is that you really need to find the root cause of a problem if you actually want to solve it for good, not just keep putting band-aids on the symptoms.
And this is where that visual tool he talks about comes in, right? The Ishikawa diagram.
Yes. And it sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. It's basically like a mind map, but specifically for problem solving. You start with the problem itself and then branch out to all the potential contributing factors, kind of like a detective tracing clues back to the source.
I love the example he uses in the book about the Challenger space shuttle disaster.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful one. Because at first glance, it seemed like a simple technical malfunction, right? But when they really dug deep using this kind of root cause analysis, it turned out to be so much more complex than that. There were all these underlying organizational and even cultural factors that contributed to the tragedy.
Right, and I think that's such an important lesson for all of us. We often jump to conclusions about what's causing a problem without really taking the time to understand all the underlying factors.
Absolutely. And to help us avoid those kinds of disasters in the first place, Sanchez Crespo offers this other really cool tool called the pre-mortem analysis.
Pre-mortem. Sounds a little ominous, doesn't it?
It does, but it's actually brilliant. It's basically a mental exercise where you imagine your project, whatever it is, has already failed, and then you work backward like, okay, if this failed, what were all the potential points of failure that led to this outcome?
So it's kind of like reverse engineering a disaster.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is that it forces you to think critically and creatively about all the things that could go wrong, which then allows you to either come up with solutions in advance or at the very least be more prepared if and when those challenges arise.
So far, we've been, thinking on this like individual level, right?
Hmm.
How can I be a better thinker? But Sanchez Crespo, he doesn't stop there. He takes it a step further and reminds us that we're not just thinking in isolation, are we? There's this whole social dimension to how our minds work.
Right. He talks about society as this kind of superorganism where each of us is like a cell and we're all interconnected, right? Our thoughts influencing each other, sometimes in really powerful ways.
It makes you think about the spread of ideas, trends, even like social movements. Those are all driven by this collective thinking process, right?
Exactly. And like any complex system, there are these amazing benefits to that interconnectedness, like the potential for collaboration, for innovation, for rapid progress. But as Sanchez Crespo points out, there are also some inherent dangers.
Yeah, he gets into some kind of scary territory when he talks about the dangers of herd mentality, right? Like
Wow.
how easily we can get swept up in groupthink, especially when we're not being mindful of our own thought processes.
Right. And it's easy to think, oh, that would never happen to me. But he brings up some really sobering historical examples like, the Holocaust, where this kind of mass delusion took hold and it led to these horrific consequences.
It's a stark reminder that we're all susceptible to this, right?
Right.
Which is why he stresses the importance of constantly seeking out diverse viewpoints, challenging our own assumptions, and really being willing to change our minds when presented with new information.
And to that end, he introduces this really interesting concept called cooperative debating, which I think is such a refreshing alternative to how we often approach disagreements.
Oh yeah, tell me more about that. I love that phrase, cooperative debating. It seems like kind of an oxymoron, right?
It does, because we usually think of debating as this adversarial thing, where the goal is to win, to prove the other person wrong. But with cooperative debating, it's like you're saying, okay, we both come to this with different perspectives, different information. Let's put our heads together and see if we can come to a better understanding together.
So it's less about, scoring points and more about this genuine search for truth, for the best solution, whatever that might be.
Exactly. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with, thinking being a skill, because it takes real effort and intentionality to approach disagreements this way, to be open to being wrong, to being willing to change your mind.
It's so easy to just surround ourselves with people who agree with us, isn't it? But Sanchez Crespo is really pushing us to step outside of our echo chambers and engage with different perspectives, even when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And I love how he wraps up the book on this really inspiring and empowering note with his emphasis on the power of small, continuous improvements. He even uses the Japanese word kaizen for it.
Oh yeah, Kaizen. I've heard of that. It's like that philosophy of constant incremental improvement, right?
Exactly. It's the idea that you don't have to make these massive overnight changes to see big results. Even just these tiny tweaks to your habits, to your thinking, to your approach, when you do them consistently over time, they can really add up. It's like compound interest for your mind.
He gives that great example of how even small amounts of money, when invested consistently, can grow exponentially over time, right?
Exactly. And it's the same principle with personal growth. Don't underestimate the power of those small daily actions, those tiny improvements you make to your thinking, to your skills, to your knowledge base. Over time, they can lead to some pretty incredible transformations.
I love that. It's such a hopeful and encouraging message, isn't it? We're not stuck with the mental habits we have today. We can always be learning, growing, evolving.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I appreciate most about Sanchez Crespo's book. It's not just about thinking differently, it's about embracing this lifelong journey of becoming a better thinker.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From generating new ideas to solving problems more effectively to understanding how our individual minds interact within this larger social context.
It's been quite a deep dive.
It has. And I don't know about you, but I'm already thinking about how I can apply some of these tools in my own life. That scamper method, for example, seems like it could be really useful for breaking out of a creative rut. Maybe that's a deep dive for another day.
Definitely. I'd be up for that. And I'm sure our listeners have a lot to think about as well.
That's right. And on that note, we always like to leave you with something to ponder, a little challenge to take with you. So as you go about your week, think about a recent decision you made, or maybe a problem you're facing. Now, imagine approaching it through the lens of the techniques we talked about today. Do you think it might change your perspective, or maybe even lead to a different outcome? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
That's a great question to consider.
And on that note, until next time, happy thinking, everyone.